Some children will remember the last day they spent with their mother very clearly. A hug, a meal, a good night wish. But some children are too young to understand that while they are sleeping peacefully upstairs, the lives of their entire family are changing forever. That night, inside a house on Donington Road, two little girls, just 5 and 2 years old, went to bed, as they did every other night. They had no idea that only a few rooms away, their mother was living through the final hours of her life. There were no alarm sirens. No one ran next door to call for help. No neighbors knew exactly what was happening behind the closed door. There was only a silent house. And by the following morning, that mother would never again walk upstairs to wake her two daughters. Her name was Isabella Knight. The people who loved her often called her Izzy. But what makes this case so haunting is not only the way Izzy was discovered, it is also what she was doing before everything came to an end. During the final hours of her life, Izzy was searching for a new home, somewhere else to live, a different beginning. Perhaps she was looking at the rooms where her two daughters might grow up. Perhaps she was imagining a life beyond a marriage that was no longer what it once had been. No one knows exactly what Izzy was thinking as she looked at the screen, but we do know one thing. She was looking toward the future. While that future was only hours away from being taken from her. Then, an argument took place. Money, debt, tensions that had been building for a long time. The period between 11:52 p.m. on June 12 and 2:24 a.m. the following morning would later become one of the most crucial windows in the investigation. Because during those hours, Isabella, Izzy Knight, was attacked. And she would never see the sunrise again. Hello everyone, and thank you for returning to the channel. Today, we will piece together every part of a case that is not only about a terrible crime, but also about the story of a woman who was trying to begin her life again. But before we continue, if you enjoy true crime stories told through an in-depth perspective, following the events of the case and the search for the truth, please subscribe to the channel to support us. Your support will help us continue bringing you more high-quality stories in the future. What is strange is that Izzy's body was not discovered immediately after that night. Hours passed. The house remained still on its familiar street. The outside world continued as normal. Until, the following afternoon, a car collision occurred in the parking lot of a McDonald's. An incident that initially appeared to have absolutely nothing to do with Izzy. But the unusual behavior of the man involved in the collision caused police to start asking questions. And their next decision led officers to the house on Donington Road. There, they found Izzy, dead. Police later discovered a note that had been left inside the house. A note that led the investigation directly to the man who had once lived with Izzy under that same roof. Her husband, Paul Knight. But this was only the beginning. Because to understand what truly happened during Izzy's final night, we have to go back in time. Back to before the police arrived. Before the car collision, before the house became a crime scene, and before Isabella Knight became known across the country as the victim of a murder case. Who was Izzy? How had her marriage changed over time? And why, when she was preparing to search for a new life, did everything end in a way that no one could ever reverse? I want to leave you with a question. In a relationship that has already begun to fall apart, what do you think is more frightening? A. Staying because you hope that things will eventually change. B. When one person decides to leave, but that decision makes the situation even more dangerous. Comment A or B and share your thoughts in the comment section. Now let us return to Isabella Izzy Knight. Because before she became a name in a case file, she was a daughter, a loved one, a mother, and a woman who was trying to find a new path for her life. Before Isabella Izzy Knight became a name that appeared in an investigation file, in news reports, and eventually before a courtroom, she had an entirely different life. A life built from very ordinary things. Family, children, loved ones. Personal interests. Small moments of happiness that, while they were happening, no one could have imagined would one day become memories that those left behind would struggle to hold on to. Izzy, 32, was not simply a married woman and the mother of 2 children. To her parents, Tim and Helena, she was first and foremost their daughter. To Georgina, she was a sister. And to her 2 young daughters, Izzy was the center of an entire world, one they were still far too young to understand, could change overnight. To a child, a mother is not a complicated concept. A mother is the person who is there every morning. The person who knows what her child likes to eat. Who knows when they are sad. Who knows how to comfort them when they cry. And sometimes, Because that presence feels so familiar, we do not realize how precious it truly is until it suddenly disappears. That is one of the most heartbreaking parts of Izzy's story. Her two daughters were far too young to fully understand what had happened, but they would still have to grow up in a life where their mother was no longer there. Those who loved Izzy remembered her for more than the tragedy that would eventually define the final chapter of her life. They remembered her personality. A warm, kind, and caring woman who paid attention to the people around her. Izzy had a love for art and creativity. It was not simply a hobby to pass the time. It was part of who she was, a part of the way she saw the world. And like so many mothers, Izzy wanted to share the things she loved with her children. She encouraged her two daughters to be creative. She encouraged them to explore the things they enjoyed. Perhaps that was one of the quiet ways a mother leaves her mark on her children's lives. Not through grand lessons, but through the things that happen again and again each day. Sitting together, playing a game, drawing a picture, offering a few words of encouragement. While they are happening, those moments may seem completely ordinary. But when someone is no longer there, they become the very moments a family wishes they could return to, just to experience them one more time. Izzy's father once spoke about his daughter with pride. To her family, she was not someone defined by the difficulties in her marriage. She was a person in her own right, a woman with her own personality, things that made her happy, people she loved, a life that had existed long before the name Paul Knight became connected to her story. And that is especially important. Because if we look at Izzy only through the lens of her final night, we risk missing the entire life that came before it. A 32-year-old woman who still had so much life left to live. A mother who might have been there for her daughter's first days at school, their birthdays, family holidays, the milestones and moments of growing up that any mother would hope to witness. But there is something about Izzy's story that makes it especially painful. She was not someone who had given up hope. At least, what she was doing during the final period of her life suggests something very different. Izzy was beginning to think about change. Not about changing who she was, but about changing the circumstances she no longer wanted to continue living in. After the fractures in her marriage and discussions about divorce, Izzy appeared to have begun looking toward another chapter in her life. A chapter in which she could have more control over her own future. And at that time, she was searching for a new place to live. That detail does not need to be exaggerated to be heartbreaking. Because on its own, it already suggests something very clear. Izzy was looking forward. She was still making plans for tomorrow. She was still thinking about the lives of her two daughters. And she still believed there was another path ahead of her. But sometimes, a life is remembered not only for what happened, it is also remembered for everything that never had the chance to happen. A new home, a new life, a new chapter. Everything stopped at the stage of intention and those first steps toward a different future. And that is what makes the story of Isabella Izzy Knight more than simply a crime case. Behind that name was a woman with a life of her own, people who loved her, and plans for the future. And to understand why a woman who was trying to move forward never had the chance to complete that journey, we need to look more closely at the marriage Izzy appeared to be preparing to leave behind. Because behind that seemingly ordinary home, the cracks had been forming for a long time. And the man living with Izzy, Paul Knight, was carrying his own problems as well. Problems involving cocaine addiction, debt, financial pressure, and a marriage that was gradually moving toward its end. The marriage of Isabella Izzy Knight and Paul Knight did not collapse because of a single argument on one particular night. Before everything reached its irreversible conclusion, there had already been signs that their life together was becoming increasingly difficult. These problems did not appear all at once. They built up gradually over time, through poor decisions, unresolved issues, and pressures that neither of them seemed able to overcome. Paul Knight was Izzy's husband and the father of their two young daughters. For a long time, he had struggled with cocaine addiction. According to information presented in the case, Paul's drug use had continued for approximately a decade. A decade is a very long time. Long enough for a habit to become a dependency. Long enough for the consequences to extend beyond just one person. And when someone within a family carries an unresolved problem for years, the people around them often end up living with the consequences as well. For the Knight family, one of the clearest consequences was financial pressure. Paul had borrowed £16,000 in an attempt to deal with his debts, but money did not seem to be simply a matter of numbers in a bank account. In a marriage that was already falling apart, financial problems can become symbols of something much larger. Trust, responsibility, disappointment, and the question, is the other person really going to change? These may not be questions spoken aloud during every argument, but they can still exist silently between two people. Izzy had considered divorce for around 18 months before her death. That suggests that the idea of leaving the marriage was not an impulsive decision made in the final days of her life. She had thought about it. There were times when she wanted to end the relationship. Then, the marriage appeared to have been given another chance. The two of them had attempted to reconcile. But reconciliation does not always mean that the problems which caused a relationship to break down have truly disappeared. Sometimes, two people come back together because of hope, because of their children, because of the years they have already shared, or simply because they want to believe that this time, things might be different. But hope, when it is not accompanied by genuine change, can sometimes do nothing more than delay a separation. And that appears to have been the case with Izzy and Paul. By June, their reconciliation had failed. They were no longer sleeping in the same room. They were still living in the same house and raising their two children, but the distance within their marriage had become increasingly clear. The house was still there, but what it represented had changed. Neighbors had reportedly heard arguments. Money was one of the issues that came up. But perhaps the most important point is not simply that a married couple argued. After all, many couples argue. What matters is the context in which those arguments were taking place. This was a marriage that appeared to be approaching its end. Izzy was no longer simply unhappy. She had begun thinking about a life outside that relationship. Meanwhile, Paul was still dealing with debt and a long-standing cocaine addiction. Those problems do not, by themselves, explain or excuse what happened later. That point needs to be made clearly. No amount of debt makes violence acceptable. No addictive substance automatically removes a person's responsibility for their actions. But to understand a case, we still need to examine the full context. And the context of this story was a marriage that had been fractured for a long time. A woman who was gradually moving toward the decision to leave. A man living with increasingly serious problems of his own. And two people who were still sharing the same home, even though their relationship was no longer what it had once been. Then came June 12th, a day that may have begun like any other, but as night fell, the tensions that had existed inside that house surfaced once again. Money became the cause of another argument. And no one could have known that this time, the argument would not end with silence, a closed door, or another night spent sleeping in separate rooms. This time, it would lead to something entirely different. Something that would change the fate of the Knight family forever. The night of June 12 was not the first night Isabella Izzy Knight and Paul Knight had lived under the same roof while carrying distances between them that neither seemed able to erase. Their marriage had already begun to fracture. Arguments about money were no longer unfamiliar. They had been sleeping in separate rooms. Izzy had considered divorce and was trying to imagine a different life for herself and her two young daughters. But no matter how much their marriage had changed, they were still living under the same roof. The same kitchen. The same walls. The same two children growing up inside that home. And perhaps that is what makes the tragedy of that night even more haunting. Because for the two little girls, aged 5 and 2, that night may have begun like so many others. They went to bed. The house gradually fell silent. And at their age, they could not possibly have known that while they were sleeping, something was happening downstairs that would change their entire lives. Not the next day. Not years later. But that very night. According to information presented in the case, Isabella and Paul argued about money on the evening of June 12. An argument. Just a few simple words. But behind it were pressures that had existed long before that night. Debt. Problems within the marriage. A relationship moving toward its end. And two people who no longer seemed able to communicate with each other as they once had. No one other than the people inside that house can know exactly what words were spoken. No one can turn back time and witness the precise moment when the argument began to change. But investigators later focused on a specific period of time. From 11:52 p.m. on June 12 until 2:24 a.m. on June 13. That was the final period of Isabella Knight's life. During that time, Izzy was attacked. Forensic evidence later showed that pressure had been applied to her neck for long enough to cause cardiac arrest. A pillow was also involved in the events that took place. And when those details are placed alongside one another, it is impossible not to see the heartbreaking contrast. Upstairs, two children were still asleep. Downstairs, their mother was living through the final moments of her life. Perhaps the following morning, the two girls would still wake up. Perhaps they would still expect to see their mother. Perhaps they could not yet understand why everything around them was beginning to change. But what the adults would soon know was that Isabella Izzy Knight would never be able to answer another question again. Her life ended at the age of 32. Only hours earlier, she had still been searching for a new home. Still looking ahead, still thinking about the future, but after that night, every plan she had made was cut short. However, what would later make the investigation even more difficult to comprehend was not only how Izzy died, it was also what happened afterward. Paul Knight did not immediately call the police. According to information presented in court, the following morning, he contacted his mother and asked her to collect his two daughters. The reason Paul gave was that both he and Izzy were unwell. The two children were then taken out of the house. And once again, there is a detail that forces us to pause. They left that house without knowing that their mother was still inside. But their mother would never walk out again. After the two girls left, Paul remained alone in the house. During that time, he wrote a note and made unsuccessful attempts to take his own life. Then, eventually, Paul left Donington Road. The door closed behind him. Inside the house, Isabella Knight was still there. And at that moment, the outside world still had no idea what had happened. There was no emergency call reporting a murder. No police officers standing outside the house. No neighbors who knew that behind that closed door, a family had been changed forever. That secret might have remained hidden for even longer. If, just a few hours later, Paul Knight had not been involved in a collision in the parking lot of a McDonald's, an incident that initially appeared to have nothing to do with Izzy, a moment that might otherwise have been seen as nothing more than a minor accident during an ordinary day. But it was there that Paul's behavior caused police officers to sense that something was not right. And from that suspicion, a decision was made. Police would return to the address on Donington Road. They did not yet know what they were about to discover. But when the door to that house was opened, the truth about the night of June 12 would begin to emerge. And from that moment on, the story of Isabella Izzy Knight was no longer simply the story of a marriage falling apart. It had become a murder investigation. The collision in the McDonald's car park, viewed in isolation, might have seemed like nothing more than a minor incident on an ordinary day. But sometimes, the events that appear completely unrelated become the very link that prevents a secret from remaining hidden. On the afternoon of June 13th, Paul Knight drove away from the house on Donington Road. At around 3:30 p.m., his vehicle was involved in a collision in the car park of a McDonald's. At the time, no one witnessing the incident knew that only a few hours earlier, a tragedy had taken place inside the house Paul had just left. No one knew that Isabella Izzy Knight was still inside, no longer alive, and the outside world had no idea. Police arrived to deal with the collision. At first, it was simply routine work, a traffic incident that needed to be handled. But then, the officers began to pay attention to Paul. According to information presented in the case, his behavior caused them to feel that something was not right. There are moments in an investigation that do not begin with a clear piece of evidence. Police do not always begin with a confession. There is not always a witness pointing toward a house and saying, "Something happened in there." Sometimes, it begins with nothing more than the feeling that one particular detail does not fit. And in this case, that sense of something being wrong led the officers to look beyond what appeared to be a simple car collision. They decided to check the address where Paul Knight lived. It was a decision that, at the moment it was made, no one could have known would lead to what came next. The journey back to Donington Road may have taken only a short time, but for Izzy's story, it was the moment when everything began to change. The secret was still waiting behind the door of that house. A house that only days earlier had been the home of a family. A place filled with the sounds of children, meals, conversations, and tensions that outsiders could not see. But now, it had become the place that held the final hours of a 32-year-old woman's life. When police arrived at Donington Road and entered the house, they found Isabella Knight. Izzy was lying in a bedroom. She was dead. From that moment, everything changed. This was no longer a welfare check. No longer a concern prompted by unusual behavior following a car collision. The house immediately became the scene of a serious investigation, and during their search, police found something else: a note. According to information presented in the case, the note had been left by Paul Knight. In it, he admitted to killing Izzy while also claiming that he had not intended for her to die. But from that moment, an important legal question began to emerge. Paul admitted that he had caused her death, But what had actually happened inside that room? Was it an act that resulted in death without an intention to kill, as he appeared to claim? Or would the evidence point to a greater level of criminal responsibility? Police could not simply stop at the note. An admission is important, but a murder investigation cannot be built on a single statement alone. They needed to establish the precise cause of death. They needed to determine the timeline of what had happened. They needed to examine the scene, to compare the physical evidence, electronic data, and witness statements. And most importantly, they needed to reconstruct what had happened during the period of time when Izzy could no longer tell her own story. In murder cases, the victim is often denied the opportunity to speak for themselves. There is no final explanation, no opportunity to respond, no chance to challenge the version of events being presented by someone else. That is why the task of an investigation is to allow the evidence that remains to speak. A phone call, a note, a trace left inside a room, a piece of recorded data, a specific time appearing in an official record. Each individual piece may not reveal the entire truth, but when those pieces are brought together, they can reconstruct a story that perhaps only one surviving person knows in full. And in the case of Isabella Izzy Knight, Paul Knight was the only person left from the room where her life came to an end. But from this point forward, the investigation would not rely solely on what Paul had to say. Investigators began to do what mattered most. They began to follow the evidence. Every detail, every trace, every moment in time, because the question was no longer simply who had caused Izzy's death. The question now was, what really happened inside that room, and would the evidence that remained tell a different story from Paul Knight's explanation? When police began their investigation, they faced no simple task. Isabella Izzy Knight could no longer tell anyone what had happened to her during the final hours of her life. The only person who knew the full sequence of events from that night was Paul Knight. But in a murder investigation, the account of the person who survived cannot, by itself, become the truth. Every explanation has to be tested. And from that point on, investigators began their most important work, allowing the evidence to speak on behalf of the victim. The house on Donington Road was secured. Every room was examined. Every detail was recorded. Because in cases like this, the truth is rarely found in a single piece of evidence. More often, it exists in small, fragmented details that may initially appear unrelated. A period of time, a physical trace, a note, data stored on an electronic device, an action that took place before or after the crime. And the task of the investigation is to place all of those pieces alongside one another. Forensic evidence became one of the most important foundations of the case. The post-mortem examination showed that Izzy died after pressure was applied to her neck for long enough to cause cardiac arrest. This allowed investigators to move beyond their initial assumptions. Izzy's death was not an unexplained event. It was not a simple accident. Her body carried the final evidence of what had happened to her, and although Izzy could no longer speak, the forensic findings became part of the final story she left behind. Then there was what police found inside the house. The note left by Paul was an important piece of evidence. In it, he admitted to killing Izzy while also claiming that he had not intended for her to die. That statement would later become an important point in the legal process. Because admitting responsibility for causing a death does not mean that every question has been answered. Police still needed to determine exactly how the act had taken place, how long it had lasted, and whether the objective evidence was consistent with the way Paul described what had happened. But the investigation did not stop at the crime scene. Investigators also examined the traces of Izzy's life before her death. In the modern world, part of our lives is preserved on phones, computers, and other electronic devices. What we search for, the places we plan to go, the conversations we have, the plans we never get the chance to carry out. For Izzy, her property searches became an important part of reconstructing the final hours of her life. That data could not reveal exactly what Izzy was thinking, but it showed one thing very clearly. She was looking for a new place to live. In a case where the marriage appeared to be coming to an end, that detail helped investigators better understand the circumstances in which Izzy had been living. She was not simply going through a troubled marriage. She had already begun taking the first steps toward changing her life. Another line of investigation focused on Paul Knight. Tests showed that cocaine was present in his system during the period relevant to the case. This was an important detail in understanding the broader context, but it was not an alternative explanation for responsibility. The presence of a drug could help the court and investigators better understand Paul's state at the time, but it could not answer the question of what he had actually done. Piece by piece, the evidence began to form a chain, a marriage that was breaking down. Izzy searching for a new home, an argument during the night, the period of time leading up to her death, the forensic evidence, Paul's note, his actions afterward. And finally, the collision that led police back to the house on Donington Road. Viewed separately, each detail told only a small part of the story, but when they were brought together, they began to create an increasingly clear picture. And from that point, the case entered a different stage. The question was no longer simply what had happened to Isabella Knight. A larger question began to emerge. Why had a marriage that was already coming to an end resulted in a death? Izzy was preparing to step away from an old chapter of her life. Paul was dealing with problems of his own, and between them was a marriage that could no longer continue as it once had. To understand the rest of the case, we need to look more closely at the relationship between them, at the moment Izzy was preparing to leave, and at what unfolded afterward during the legal process. Because as the evidence began to speak, another question slowly came into focus. Was Izzy's death simply the result of a moment of lost control? Or was there a more complex story behind it, one involving the breakdown of a relationship, control, and the moment a woman decided that she wanted to leave her marriage? As the evidence began to come together, the case of Isabella "Izzy" Knight was no longer focused solely on the question of how she died. Another question gradually became more important. Why? Why did a marriage that had lasted for years, that had seen attempts at reconciliation and the building of a family together, end with the death of a woman who was only 32 years old? This is perhaps the most difficult part of looking at any case involving two people who once loved each other. Because the reasons behind an act of violence cannot always be reduced to a single sentence. An argument does not automatically explain a death. Debt alone is not enough to explain everything. And Paul Knight's use of cocaine cannot become an excuse for shifting responsibility onto a substance. Those factors provide context, but what was truly happening inside Paul's mind at that moment is something only he could fully know. However, investigators and the court did not focus on a single moment in isolation. They looked at the entire sequence of events. Izzy had considered ending the marriage on several occasions. Eventually, their attempts at reconciliation had failed. The two were living in the same house, but were no longer sleeping in the same room. And Izzy had begun searching for a new place to live. That is what makes this part of the story particularly significant. There is a major difference between someone saying that they are unhappy and someone beginning to prepare to actually leave. Words can change. An argument can pass. But when someone begins searching for another home and starts imagining a different life, it suggests that the decision is becoming increasingly real. Izzy appeared to have reached that point. According to information presented during the investigation, Paul was said to have been influenced by jealousy and self-focused thinking. This formed part of the way investigators viewed the broader context of the case. But it is important to distinguish clearly between what was presented in the case and what can only be speculation. No one can say with certainty that a single factor alone led to Izzy's death. The case was the result of a sequence of events, and criminal responsibility had to be determined on the basis of Paul's actions and the specific evidence available. After his arrest, Paul Knight did not immediately plead guilty to murder. He admitted responsibility for Izzy's death at the level of manslaughter, a lesser offense than murder. The difference between the two is not simply a matter of terminology. In criminal law, determining whether an act constitutes murder or manslaughter is directly connected to the nature of the act, the defendant's state of mind, and the legal factors considered in the case. The prosecution did not accept Paul's plea to manslaughter. As a result, the case continued. On October 15th, Paul denied the charge of murder. A trial was scheduled to examine the full body of evidence and determine his criminal responsibility. But then, on January 8th, at the very moment the trial was due to begin, Paul Knight changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to murder. There are moments in a criminal case when a single statement can change everything that follows. "I'm guilty." After that plea, the trial no longer proceeded as originally planned. But for Izzy's family, Paul's admission of guilt did not mean that every question had been answered, because a guilty plea can establish legal responsibility, but it cannot answer every question that those left behind continue to carry. Why did Izzy have to die? What happened during her final moments? And why was a woman who was trying to begin a new chapter in her life never given the chance to begin it? Those questions may never have an answer that feels sufficient to her family. But at the very least, Paul's guilty plea brought the case to the final stage of the legal process. Paul Knight would have to stand before the court. No longer simply as a man accused of a crime, but as the man who had admitted to murdering his wife. And at Northampton Crown Court, the final sentence would be handed down. But before the judge could announce the number of years Paul would spend in prison, there was already one truth that could never be changed. No matter what judgment the law delivered, Isabella Izzy Knight would never come home. And her two young daughters would have to grow up in a world where neither their mother nor their father could be there for them in the way they once had been. On January 29th, at Northampton Crown Court, the legal journey in the case of Isabella Izzy Knight reached one of its final moments. But for her family, perhaps no one truly felt that this was an ending, because a trial can come to an end. A sentence can be handed down. A defendant can be led away from the courtroom. But for those who have lost someone they love, time does not stop with the sound of a judge's gavel. Paul Knight stood before the court to hear the sentence for the act he had admitted committing. Earlier, Paul had pleaded guilty to murder, the murder of the woman who had once been his wife and the mother of his two daughters. Judge Adrian Lucking then sentenced Paul Knight to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 17 years and 1 month before he could be considered for parole. It was the most severe sentence available under the British legal system for murder. But even when we hear the words life imprisonment, it is important to understand that the numbers spoken inside a courtroom can never fully measure the consequences left behind by a crime like this. Because behind Paul Knight's sentence was an emptiness that no sentence could ever fill. Helena, Izzy's mother, spoke about the thoughts that continued to haunt her after her daughter's death. It was not only the pain of losing her child, it was also the anguish of imagining what Izzy may have gone through during the final moments of her life. That is a kind of pain that cannot be resolved by a legal judgment alone. The law can determine who is responsible, but it cannot erase memories. It cannot restore the days that were lost. And most importantly, it cannot bring Isabella back to her two young daughters. Perhaps that is the most heartbreaking consequence of the entire story. Those two children did not simply lose their mother. Their lives were also changed completely after the night of June 12th. Their father became the man convicted of murdering their mother. A tragedy that, even though they were far too young to understand it at the time, may continue to shape their lives as they grow older. And that is when we begin to understand that a murder never has only one victim. The person who dies suffers the direct and irreversible consequence. But those left behind must live with the aftermath. Parents lose a child. Brothers and sisters lose someone they love. Friends lose a friend. And children lose the person who should have been there beside them during some of the most important years of their lives. Looking back at the entire story, what makes Izzy's case especially haunting is not simply the way it ended. It is also the moment in her life when it happened. Izzy was not looking backward. She was trying to move forward. She was searching for a new home. She was preparing for another chapter in her life. Perhaps no one knows exactly what that new chapter would have looked like. No one knows where Izzy would have lived, what kind of home her two daughters would have grown up in, or how her life might have changed after leaving her marriage. But, at the very least, she still had one thing that all of us have at any given moment in our lives: a tomorrow. And then, in the space of a single night, that tomorrow disappeared. Perhaps that is why the story of Isabella Izzy Knight should not be remembered simply as the case in which Paul Knight was convicted. Because if we remember only the perpetrator, the charge, and the sentence, we risk allowing the victim to fade into the background once again. Izzy was a 32-year-old woman, a daughter deeply loved by her family, a mother, a person with her own interests, her own personality, and plans she never had the chance to complete. And perhaps the most haunting image left behind after everything that happened is not the courtroom, not the life sentence, and not even the house where she was found. It is the image of a woman searching for a new home, a place where she hoped she could begin again, a future she was trying to reach, but one she would never have the chance to touch. After everything that happened, perhaps what remains is not simply Paul Knight's name in the court records. What remains is Isabella Izzy Knight, her two daughters, a family forced to learn how to continue living after an irreversible loss, and a painful reminder that behind every criminal case there is more than a crime scene, an investigation, or a sentence. Behind it, there is always a life. A life that once had a past, ordinary days, people who loved them, and most importantly, a future. But for Isabella Izzy Knight, that future came to an end forever, on the night she would never live to see the sunrise.